Welcome into the Level Flight Podcast. My name is Connor. I've got Brian here with me today. And in just a few moments, Scott Wheeler of The Athletic will be joining us. We just wrapped up the interview with Scott. It was great. Brian, Scott Wheeler joining the program. What were your thoughts?
I mean, as always, this is now the second time he's been on the show with us. He has allowed us to sort of look a little bit closer at some of these guys that we're really, excited about, but we don't exactly know the full story sometimes. So we got a chance to really, hear about, the guys at the World Juniors, Rutger McGroarty, Elias Salmonson, Fabian Wagner was, there as well. But we brought it back to North America, talking about guys like Brad Lambert, Chaz Lucius and his injury problems, and even at the NHL level, we had a nice conversation about Cole Perfetti. So, yeah, as always, Scott was terrific and one of my favorite interviews that we have. So, and maybe we'll see him again later this year too.
Yeah, that would be fun. And as always, you can find Scott's stuff at The Athletic. He plugged a bunch of stuff. You'll hear it in the episode. He's got a bunch of rankings coming up, so make sure you're on the lookout for that. And thank you once again to Scott for taking the time. He talked about how busy of a time it is, so we are very gracious that he took the time to be on this episode. And we'll look forward to talking to Scott soon and enjoy the interview, everyone. Welcome back into the Level Flight Podcast. My name is Connor. I am joined by Brian today. And like we said at the end of the last episode, we've got a special guest joining us. He joined us a few months ago. The World Juniors happened. He's the guy, Scott Wheeler from The Athletic. Scott, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. Ramping up for my 32 prospect pool rankings here. This is kind of my busiest. This next month or so is kind of my busiest time of the year, even busier than the draft year, at least from a work standpoint, just because I have so much writing to do. Like it ends up being 100,000 plus words for the 32 pieces. Plus I got trips and other stories to write while I'm doing all of that. So trying to get a head start on it. I've got like the first 9 or 10 of them written at this point. Jets fans will be happy to know that the Jets aren't in that first 9 or 10, which is positive.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's this is the sort of final grind after a busy month with the World Juniors and selection camp and the 2 top prospects games in Canada and the US. And we're just sort of ramping up now to finish this. And then hopefully in February, March, I'll have a little bit of a breather.
Yeah, I remember seeing your coverage during the juniors, and to think that you're busier now is crazy, because that was a lot in that little 10-day span or whatever that was. But
yeah,
we're glad to have you back on. Thanks for the time. Let's start with the World Juniors and the team that won. Let's start at the top. Team USA. Rutger McGroarty was the captain. Obviously, he had that back injury, rib injury. That kept him out of the pre-tournament, the getting up to speed. He played the first game, clearly looked rusty. Once he got back up to speed, what did you see out of Rutger in this tournament as a player and leading the team to gold?
Yeah, I think in the second half of the tournament, he looked like himself, which was sort of what you were hoping for. You knew after he'd been in a non-contact jersey through their selection camp and didn't really participate in the pre-tournament action and wasn't really even skating fully in terms of contact practices until really the tournament began, in essence. You knew that it was going to take him a little bit of time, and it did. I thought he sort of, you don't want to say he didn't play well because he was still working his way back, but he wasn't the Rutger that you expect in those first few games. Then he sort of looked like himself. He was holding on to pucks. He was going to sort of the slot, to the home plate area, if you will, to create looks for himself and get open for himself. He was working. There were some playmaking sort of elements that sort of began to shine through in terms of facilitating for his line mates, whether that was Cutter Gauthier and Oliver Moore, or Cutter Gauthier and Jimmy Snuggerud. They kind of rotated Moore and Snuggerud on and off of that line. And then obviously he wore the C, and he was the usual Rutger in front of the media for sure, in terms of just a ton of life, great, just character. And I don't mean character in the sort of classic hockey sense of sort of character guy. I mean character in terms of the personality. Like he's Jets fans are going to love him that way. He's kind of one of a kind. He's got a ton of life and charisma and just sort of great energy about him. So Yeah, it's obviously before the injury, before the rib injury, he was one of the best players in college hockey at the start of this season. You just hope that he can sort of get back to that now. And then they've likely got a decision in the spring on him in terms of whether it's time to turn pro or whether he goes back for his junior year. So that's sort of the next step for him, is go on a nice run in Big Ten play with Michigan, and then if you can get through that and you can be a top player, what does that look like in terms of, is it time, or is he ready to take that next step?
And I mean, with what we've seen so far, and obviously that the leadership, the media work, everything, Jets fans have fallen in love with him just because of how great he is in front of the camera. But in terms of his, on ice stuff, what would you say sort of a realistic floor ceiling would be for him? Obviously, he's working his way back from that injury. And to put you on the spot, are there any current NHL comparisons that sort of come to mind?
Well, in terms of the floor ceiling, high floor guy for sure. Like, he's going to be an NHL player. There isn't a lot of risk there in terms of that kind of a projection. Because of how sort of strong he is, you run into him around the rink, you quickly learn that he's a pretty sort of physically mature kid in terms of muscle mass and that kind of a thing. Because of the character piece, because of how well-rounded his game is, he's going to play. And he's one of those guys who, as a first-round pick, isn't in the way that Brad Lambert is, for example, isn't a sort of top 6 or nothing guy. Like, Brad Lambert's not going to play on a fourth line in the NHL. That's just not who he is. A different story with Rutger. You could see him playing in a bottom 6 role for the first few years of his career, and then sort of working his way up in the prime of his career into more of a sort of prominent role. That's a realistic path for him to take, and that's not true for everybody, and that's a good thing. That's a good. Those are good assets to have. So ceiling, I think you're looking at sort of, if he's a PP2, if he's a second line winger and a PP2 guy, the ceiling for those types of players is like 50 points, right? Like, that's typically what you hope for out of that kind of a player. Can he get onto a first power play in the prime of his career? That's probably the difference between 50 and 60 points, but that's kind of the player you're looking at. He's not going to be a star. He's not going to be a point per game guy. He's not going to be Mark Scheifele. But I think you're hoping that he can be just a really good player, like the kind of player who makes $5-6 million instead of $8-9 million, right? Like, that's sort of the projection for him. And who gives you a lot, who gives you playmaking, who gives you goal scoring, who works. He's got good feel on the puck, and the strength piece and all of that. So I think that's kind of what you're looking at. And as far as projection goes, I forget who I used. I'd have to go back through my old notes to see who I used in his draft year, because I do a sort of comparisons piece ahead of each draft. But just to sort of off the top of my head, I think look around the league at sort of really well-rounded guys who've had really sort of solid careers. A player like Brock Nelson comes to mind with the Islanders. That TJ Oshie with Washington, like, that's kind of, I think, what you're looking for. Maybe who's the former Flame who's now with the Devils. Anyways, there Tyler Toffoli. Toffoli comes to mind. Those types, Toffoli, Oshie, Brock Nelson. I think that's kind of the player you're hoping that he becomes.
Am I way off to think Nino Niederreiter, to keep it in a Jets landscape?
Yeah, I think at his ceiling, he's got a chance to be better than Nino for sure. But yeah, that fits more or less as well.
Yeah. Okay. Perfect. Yeah, great stuff on Rutger. Let's move on. The gold medal game. I mean, all 3 Jets prospects were actually in the game. On the other side, Sweden. Elias Salomonsson had a rough start to the tournament. He had the 1-game suspension after the hit from behind. Fabian Wagner kind of played a depth role for Sweden. But on Salomonsson, we talked to you a couple months ago. You said the World Juniors would be huge for him, putting his game on the national stage. What do you think he did with that opportunity? And has your outlook on him as a prospect really changed before or after the juniors?
I thought he was good. I didn't think he really grabbed it. Obviously, it was really a 2-game suspension in essence, because he delivered that hit on his very first shift of the tournament. So about 25 seconds in, if I recall correctly, to the tournament. So that was tough for him. It just set him back. I did think once he got back, he ended up on a pairing with Axel Sandin-Pellikka, who he obviously plays with Skellefteå. They're very familiar with each other. I thought that was a really good pairing for them. When he initially got back, I was a little surprised at how underutilized they were. They were playing like 17, 18 minutes the first couple of games back. But then when the games mattered, you go back and you look at those game sheets, and he was playing, Sandin-Pellikka was playing 25, but Salomonsson was also playing 21, 22. So it was tough to stand out on that blue line for the Swedes just because of how strong they were. They had 7 legitimate defensemen. Oddly enough, Theo Lindstein, the Blues late first rounder, was sort of the latest addition to the team, the youngest blue liner on that team, and he might have been the standout. He wasn't even supposed to be on that team if not for injuries to Kalle Odelius and Jacob Noren. So it's difficult when you have 3 pairings and you can roll them, and you're not like Slovakia with Maxim Sturbak, where Maxim Sturbak was playing 28 minutes a night. It can be a little bit more difficult to sort of rack up points. He wasn't a focal point on the power play. So it's harder to shine through offensively that way. But the things that he does, I think he still did well, even if he didn't sort of dominate games. And that starts with his skating. He's an excellent skater. He's a really big, strong kid. I think he's only like 6'1", but he looks bigger than that when you see him around there. Like, he carries around some weight. Not to say that he's like fat or overweight or anything, but he does he's a little doughy. And I know he's worked hard to sort of get into great shape. He's got natural athleticism in terms of the skating ability and the mobility. And you just hope that he can be a two-way transition guy at the next level. Like, I think that's the projection for Elias, is he can be hopefully more than a 6'7". That ideally he's a 4'5" for you, who is just really good in both ends, and the transition game really shines. Like, he can join the rush, he can activate, he can carry pucks up ice, he can be that fourth forward into the zone and catch up to the forwards in front of him with his skating. And then if he makes a mistake or he gets caught down ice with his skating, he can recover and get back. So there's a lot to like about Salomonsson. He was supposed to be a first rounder, if you guys recall, sort of into his draft year, was supposed to be a first rounder. Then he had after an excellent draft -2 year, kind of had a bit of a disappointing draft year. But he's been great ever since then. He broke his leg last year, and that sort of set him back. But he was great in the front half of that season. He's been a really solid SHL player for his age, playing sort of 17 minutes in the SHL, which is one of the top 2 or 3 pro leagues in the world right now. So he's a legit prospect. He's not an A-level prospect, but he's like a legit B+ D prospect that you sort of you don't pencil him in, but you sort of project that if he sort of stays on this path, he's going to be in the mix for the NHL roster at some point.
Yeah, and just sticking with Sweden, I kind of want to go away from the hockey. Well, I guess it is the hockey, but I want to talk about Gothenburg as a host city. I mean, the game Canada versus Sweden was incredible. You had Canadian fans filling the building. Obviously, the Swedish fans were there. And then the gold medal game was nuts, too. They were like chanting the entire first period. And then USA took a bit of a lead, and they started to quiet down, obviously, because their team was losing a little bit. But just what can you say about Gothenburg as not only a host city for the in-game atmosphere, but what you saw outside of the rink? Maybe on the streets with fans all across the world coming to watch their teams.
Yeah, it was great. I've obviously covered a few tournaments. I don't know what number this was. It would have been World Juniors number 8 or 9, something like that. The majority of those are in North America, but I've now been to 2 in Ostrava and in Gothenburg, and the atmosphere in Ostrava was great. The big difference between Ostrava and Gothenburg was that Ostrava, the arena, was owned by a beer company, and they were selling beer in the Czech Republic literally gets sold for like $1, $2 Canadian for a pint. And so people were building snakes, and everybody was hammered in the arena, and the vibe was different. In Gothenburg, they don't actually allow drinking in the stadium. There are designated little drinking areas on the concourse. That's very common in soccer, in European soccer as well. They don't want people with cups in the stands. It's a different atmosphere. They want people standing rather than sitting, all of that. But as a result, a tamer audience in terms of just how boisterous and rowdy it was. And yet the organization of the chants and the stomping and the jumping and the clapping and everything, that maybe because people were sober and dialed in, That was it was cool to see. I'm talking that arena was almost the size of where the Jets play. There was 12,000 fans in there, and they were all in unison. It didn't matter what jersey you were wearing. Canadians were chanting with the Swedes, and they were trying to learn the chants. They had this anthem that they'd play over the speakers that I think is like a soccer anthem in Swedish soccer that they would play, and everybody would sing along to it. The vibes were immaculate. Like it was great that way. So no issues there. Gothenburg as a city is beautiful, like great spot outside the rink. The bars were just full of people in jerseys all week long. They'd run into us in the media, and some of us would have our credentials on or whatever after a game, and everybody wants to ask you about such and such Swedish player and talk to you about Forsberg and Sundin and Henrik Lundqvist. Lundqvist is obviously a legend in Gothenburg. Frölunda is the team there, and both of the Lundqvist brothers are like icons in that town. So that part was great. The only downside of Gothenburg is this time of the year, there's only 4 or 5 hours of sunlight every day because of how far north they are. It's pretty much dark all the time. So that made it less of a sort of tourist trip for a lot of people. I think people were really hoping to see Sweden and see the city when they were there, especially the Canadians that went over. And then you just didn't really get that experience because you're going into the rink and it's dark out, and you're coming out of the rink and it's dark out. And my wife kept texting me for pictures and that kind of thing. I'm like, look, it's pitch black. There's nothing to there's nothing to take pictures of. So that part of it was different. It'll be the opposite when I go to Finland for U18 Worlds. I've done U18 Worlds in Germany and Switzerland already, and Finland. This will be my first time in Finland for U18 Worlds this spring. And it'll be the opposite, right? It's going to be 20 at that time of the year in May. It'll be 21 hours of sunlight. So they get the extremes there. You need your blackout blinds if you're living in Scandinavia.
We know hockey games move fast, but with DraftKings Sportsbook, an official sports betting partner of the NHL, you can score faster than anything happening on the ice. This week, new customers can bet $5 and get $200 instantly in bonus bets. Download the DraftKings Sportsbook app with code THPN. New customers bet $5 on the NHL and get $200 instantly in bonus bets. Only on DraftKings Sportsbook with code THPN. The crown is yours. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER or visit www.1800gambler.net. In New York, call 877-8-HOPE-NY or text HOPE-NY. In Connecticut, help is available for problem gambling. Call 888-789-777 or visit ccpg.org. Please play responsibly. On behalf of Boot Hill Casino and Resort in Kansas, licensee partner Golden Nugget Lake Charles. 21 plus, age varies by jurisdiction, void in Ontario. Bonus bets expire 168 hours after issuance. See dkng.com/hockey for eligibility and deposit restrictions, terms, and responsible gaming resources. NHL and the NHL Shield are registered trademarks of the National Hockey League. Copyright NHL 2024, all rights reserved. Well, to bring it back now to North America, and to sort of focus in more on things that are actually going on within the Jets organization, I want to ask about Brad Lambert, who he is now a AHL All-Star. How impressed have you been with his season sort of to date, and how much do you think sort of has to do with him being moved to center?
Well, first of all, I'm just happy for him. I've talked with Brad a couple of times over the years in terms of the way that he's perceived some of the criticisms of him. I've actually sort of asked him pretty pointed questions about them over the years, and he was very blunt with me. He's a very confident kid, bordering on cocky, and I think that rubbed some people the wrong way in terms of the combine process and the draft process. He's a big believer in himself, and that belief has paid off this year and really last year in taking his lumps in going down. I spoke with him at the Memorial Cup in Kelowna, or in Kamloops, sorry, and he wasn't happy about being in the WHL last year and just made the most of it, worked to round out his game, played some center there, is now playing center again. I think it helps him when he's in the middle because it forces him to be involved. One of the big criticisms of his game was sort of the way that he could come and go in games and drift to the perimeter and cheat up ice and that kind of a thing. As a center, you've got to come low. He gets touches earlier when he comes low, and he's able to use his skating to exit the zone because he's getting pucks low and he's winding up and he's sort of flying down ice. So in that way, he's not getting as many pucks at a standstill. He's getting pucks in motion. He's sort of has to be more engaged and more competitive as a centerman. All of those things I think are good for him. And then the natural gifts of the athleticism, the skating, another year of strength. Despite how freakishly athletic he is as a skater, he's never been a very strong kid. He's always been kind of long and wiry. So there was always work to do to add muscle and to fill out his frame. There's still going to be work over the next couple of years that he's going to have to do to put in some weight, or sort of add some weight. But the skill is there. The play selection has improved. I think that's a really important note. There was a lot of criticism for a time of shooting into shin pads, skating into trouble, too much one and done. He started to make better decisions with the puck. He started to involve his line mates more. All of that has helped him. And then the natural skill can take over in moments rather than him trying to force moments, right? So it's been fun to watch. There's not many kids who are sort of leading scorers in the AHL at 20 years old, right? So credit to him for rounding out his game, earning some trust with the coaching staff, with the Moose, and now he looks like Brad Lambert again. He looks like he's on an NHL path again, and that's really exciting considering where they drafted him.
Yeah, and I remember that slide, the draft year. He was supposed to go top 5 before the year, kind of similar to what you said about Salamonson, who he had a really good D-2 year, and then the draft year was not great. But yeah, that's great to see. And then there's another prospect on the Moose. We're kind of going the different direction. Another first round pick, Chaz Lucius. Dave Minuk of Illegal Curve reported the other day that he's now seeing a specialist for his ankle injury. He's been out of the lineup with concussions this year, and he had another injury earlier on in the year. I can't remember what it was, but are we reaching a point maybe with Chaz Lucius where the injuries are just becoming too much to overcome? And because what are we, 3 years removed from his draft year now, 2 years? So yeah, are the injuries becoming too much for him maybe?
Yeah, it's tough, man. It's really tough. He's been through a lot, not just the injuries you mentioned. He had a chronic knee issue that he was dealing with for a while. He's had shoulder surgery. Like it's one thing after another. Suddenly the body starts to break down. And I think it's natural for that to happen if you're in your 30s. It's worrisome if you're 20, 21 years old and you're already starting to sort of feel aches and pains and have things that are never quite right, and things when you're rehabbing something else and something else flares up and it makes it harder to rehab both at the same time. And he's just had a lot going on injury wise. I think the talent is still clearly there. When he went to Portland last year, he was as dynamic a player outside of Connor Bedard as there was in junior hockey for a short time before suffering yet another injury, which ended his season, right? So it's difficult. The natural gift as a finisher around the slot, even from mid-range, he's not sort of that long-range Alex Ovechkin type scorer, but he's a sniper from sort of anywhere in the middle of the offensive zone. He's got natural skill. He's a better playmaker than I think people gave him credit. But it's tough. He's not a super athletically gifted kid to begin with. He was never a sort of great athlete and never a super strong, fit kid, never the fastest kid. And then suddenly, if you've got things that are nagging you all the time, it becomes hard to build on top of the clear skill and the clear shooting package and sort of round out the rest. So I still believe in Lucius. I still think he's going to sort of figure it out and become an NHL player. There's enough talent there, but he's got to get healthy and stay healthy. And even when he does get back, you're looking at a longer timeline now because he just needs to spend a full season playing uninterrupted games. Like that's the biggest priority. So a tough break. They're lucky that they have guys like McGroarty and Brad who are really sort of humming along and clicking. So it's not going to hurt them in terms of having options on ELCs in the next couple of years. You hope that Colby Barlow, who's also dealt with injuries this year, can sort of add his name to that group as well. So there's still a good group there, but they were hoping that he'd be one of those same guys and fighting for a job over the next couple of years. And I'm just not sure that's realistic at this point.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen even within the Jets organization where some guys have got off to a bit of a slower start with injuries, like kind of moving forward here. Cole Perfetti lost the better part of 2 seasons because of a couple different injuries, but has really found his game this year. He was a player you were really high on as a prospect, and now that he's having a career year, what have you seen from him recently? You know, he's recently turned 22. He projects to be a fixture in the Jets' top 6. What are you seeing?
I'm seeing exactly what you'd hope to see, which is the intelligence is starting to take over. There's another kid, not a great athlete, never been a great skater. He's not pounding weight in the gym, but he has always had incredible creativity, an incredible feel for the game and spacing and where to be on the ice, and an understanding of how to get the most out of his game and how to play make and how to involve his line mates. He's got a natural wrist shot. All of those other tools are there. And it can be tough when you're average sized and you're not the quickest kid to reach your potential. But I think when there's such a high level of sort of IQ, and I don't love the term IQ because I find it kind of ambiguous. It doesn't really tell you what you're talking about, but such a high level in terms of seeing the ice, reading the ice, getting open, finding other players who are open, timing, all of that is if not elite, then close. And now it's taking over, and it's sort of Trump. It's the trump card on some of his deficiencies, if you will. So I love Cole. He's another kid, awesome kid. Like him and Rutger both are just great kids, very articulate, well-spoken kids. Not that should influence how I view them as a hockey player or that kind of a thing, but it doesn't hurt. And it's just, it makes him easier to root for, easier to like. I think he's going to be like, I still believe he's going to be a 70-point guy in the NHL. Like, I think that's the kind of player you're talking about in the prime of his career. So, and those guys don't grow on trees, right? Like if he can get to that level, he's a star player in the league. So, it's a really positive step, really this year. And you were starting to see it last year too. Like you could see it coming. So, I remain very, very high on Cole.
Yeah, and kind of further to that point, there's at least 1 or 2 times a game where he will just make a pass where you did not even see where he was looking. You did not see the player he was passing to, but it ends up right on their tape for a high danger chance. He does that with regularity, and no one else on the Jets is able to do that really at the level that he's able to, even at 22 years old. It's really impressive. You did bring up Colby Barlow. Just last question, just kind of rapid fire on some other prospects that are notable within the Jets system. Nikita Chibrikov, another smaller player that's having a good year with the Moose, putting up near point per game. Colby Barlow, you mentioned, back injury, didn't make Team Canada. And then another player who didn't make Team Canada and everyone expected him to, Dom Givanchentis, the goaltender.
Yeah.
OHL goaltender of the year last year. What's going on there? Just kind of rapid fire on those 3 notable Jets prospects.
Yeah, Barlow was disappointing. I'm not sure whether based off of his play to start the year. I mean, part of it, his play was influenced by the back, so it's hard to separate the back from the not slow start. He was still very good to start the year in the OHL, but wasn't sort of the 50 goal guy OHL player that you sort of expect Colby Barlow to be based on his pedigree and what he's accomplished in terms of goal scoring at that level prior. Colby's just quickly, but Colby's a tough one because he doesn't have the pace, and then he also isn't a sort of super cerebral smart, like he's not that Cole Perfetti type as well. So with him, it's all about the shot. It's about how hard he works. It's about his strength over pucks. Really, really physically mature kid. I mean, we all saw that last year. He's walking up on stage with a beard, right? Like he's he kind of reminded people last year. I had a few conversations with people about Aaron Ekblad at that same age, where you'd take the CHL top prospects photo and you wouldn't know whether Aaron Ekblad or Colby Barlow are coaches or players. So there's that piece with Barlow. He's just very physically mature that way. Really sort of strong kid. He's going to be a player. The question is he going to be sort of a bottom 6 guy, or can he score enough to move up and play higher in the lineup? I think ultimately he'll probably be an up and down the lineup guy. Like I think you'll probably see him on a third line at many points in his career, and then you'll probably see him move into a top 6 role and be a complimentary scorer and that kind of a thing. Like that's just kind of his mold. Chibrikov, nice story. It takes time with those Russians. You have to get them over here. You have to be patient with them in the AHL on the smaller ice surface. The details and the structure in the game in Russia is much different than it is over here. So there's some coaching elements that have to take place before those players can often make the jump, unless you're talking about Matvei Michkov or someone who's truly special kind of thing. But Chibrikov's, I mean, he's checked out all the boxes you'd hope for him to check. And if he can become a complimentary sort of middle 6 guy at some point, then that's a big win. And then DiVincentis is tough. Like it's been a bad year. Like you watch him, he just doesn't look himself. He doesn't look like he knows what he's doing in the net. And that's a big worry with a goalie when they just lose it like that. Obviously very good last year, was the front runner into the summer to be the starter on that team, and then just completely played his way off of it. He wasn't good in camp. He looked shaky. There were a couple of times where coaches were sort of warming him up in practice and beating him on sort of lofted shots from the hash marks. And there was actually one time where the coach sort of like looked at him over his glasses, kind of like that, and didn't say anything to him, but was like, come on. Like, so there's been a little bit too much of that for a kid who looked like he was going to show a lot of promise last year. And he just looks a little shaky this season. So that he's got some things to work out in terms of just shots that squeak through him that shouldn't be squeaking through him. He does have some ability, seems like a good kid in talking to him, but it's just he's got some things to figure out. And same goes for really their goalies in general. Like Milic is a long shot. I think DiVincentis is probably a long shot. Like they're just there isn't a sort of guy there in the pipes. Maybe that's a focus for one of the next 2 drafts. Unfortunately, this draft isn't a particularly strong one in net. So, but yeah, something to keep an eye on with the goaltending side of the prospect pool.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's a good way to sort of segue here, where the draft coming up, I think we would love to have you back on in and around there to see sort of what the Jets might be looking at, after the season. But no, I think that wraps it from us here. But I just want to thank you again for coming back on. One of the few who's been a repeat guest with us, and I know everyone really appreciates the insight on these young guys coming up. That maybe some of them are a little bit they're not exactly sure what to expect. So a little bit of a look into the process behind that. But before we let you go, obviously you talked about it at the top there, but anything you want to plug?
No, just my midseason draft ranking will be out in the days immediately after next week's CHL Top Prospects game. I like to get it out as soon as the 2 Top Prospects games are over. So that's the sort of top 64 for 2024 will be out. And then the 32 prospect pool rankings. There won't be a lot of storytelling from me in the next month. It's all rankings for the next month. And then I'll get back to the storytelling after that. So this is a big time of the year. I mean, people just feast at the Athletic on the prospect pool rankings. So excited to start rolling those out, and don't expect to see the Jets in the 30s or even the 20s. So that's positive.
Yeah, it's great to hear. Thanks. Like Brian said, thanks once again for your time, Scott. We really appreciate it. And yeah, we'll have you back on anytime draft season. If the Jets even have a 1st round pick, we don't know. They might make a big splash or something here, given how well they're playing. But thanks again for your time. Looking forward to those midseason rankings, and talk to you soon. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks.